Hi, this is part 2 of a bit of a series where people have sent me in questions and I'm giving you answers to those questions that they've asked me about work and things. So I'm going to start with one from Penny. Now Penny asked about how I find my subject matter and how I decide what I'm going to paint next. And basically because, well, she procrastinates, and a lot of people do. They have trouble finding things to paint. Now I used to be like that. It wasn't that I had trouble finding things to paint. I had trouble finding the right thing to paint. And so I would get really caught up. I had to find the great source picture. I had to, it had to be perfect. Everything, it had to be something I thought I could paint. It had to be something, like I just used to put so many have-tos on any image. And I used to drive myself nuts, and everything became very high stakes, okay? So every painting had to be finished. I didn't like to make mistakes. I didn't like to waste paper or waste supplies or feel as I was wasting my time. And so I used to put all this pressure and all this intense stress onto a single piece of work. And I used to drive myself nuts, to tell you the truth. So I decided a few years ago to treat my work more the way I treated my sketchbooks. Now, when I say sketchbooks, I work a lot on just loose pieces of paper, because I find if I'm working in a sketchbook and then I do a page I hate, it drives me nuts, okay? And again, it ties into this same thing. It becomes too high stakes. You don't want to muck a page up. You don't want bad pages in there. Especially now with social media, we see everyone sharing their sketchbooks, and there's, beautiful page after beautiful page, and it's like, oh my God, mine look a bit crap next to that. So I started working a lot more on loose pieces of paper, like single sheets of paper. And that freed me up, because if you don't like it, you just chuck it away. And I also chose to use cheaper paper, because I used to always work on heavyweight watercolor paper, which was expensive, so you didn't want to muck it up, you didn't want to make a mistake, you didn't want to, sort of just play around on it. You wanted to make sure you were making the most of it. So I found a paper, it's called Art Spectrum Draw and Wash, which is available here in Australia, but you can't get it elsewhere, but you'd be able to find similar products. And it was a lot cheaper, and it still accepted water really well, but it was cheap as chips, So if a drawing didn't work, it didn't matter. I just chucked it in the bin and moved on. And for me, that's what changed everything. It was like taking the stress off. Every piece of work has to be perfect, and sort of giving myself permission to not get caught up and go, I have to make this work. Sometimes I just push them aside. I come back to them. Other times I never come back to them, and that's okay. But by doing that, it allowed me to make mistakes. It allowed me to try things that I never would have tried before. It meant that if I was sitting there and, like where I'm sitting now, I can see the afternoon sun is starting to hit the tomatoes that I've got on the bench over there. And they just look beautiful. The light's coming off them the right way. And so to me, I would sit down and sketch that. Now, if I wasn't talking to you, I would probably sit down and sketch them and get a bit of colour on, and like it's just, the light's just hitting them the right way. But if I was worried about the sort of paper I was using, if I was worried about it being a finished piece of work every time, I'd go, well, no, I can't do that because it's just some tomatoes on a windowsill. So do you see what I'm getting at? It's sort of, to me, it's this perfect storm of the subject's got to be important enough, the paper's too expensive, the paint's too expensive, or I want it to look good in my sketchbook. All of these things are external things. And so if you start to take them away, then subject matter becomes a lot easier. So I try not to judge. So to me, a water bowl can be just as great to draw, and I've often drawn them and painted them and enjoyed them as much as painting, flowers, or, my perfume bottles, which a lot of you are familiar with, came out of a mistake. It was just on a little bit of paper, and I actually knocked some water onto it and the paint ran. I just went, oh, I love that effect. So I then just jumped in and got some more paper out and then started experimenting with it. And because I wasn't using this incredibly expensive paper, because I wasn't trying to do something really polished and finished, it then allowed me to sort of explore that. And now I've done a whole series of them. All right. So my next subject matter is pretty much anything that takes my fancy. And I think often if you stop and think about it, there's been things you've thought about that you would like to do, but then often you go, oh, but no one else will like them, or maybe it's not important enough, or it should be fancier, or it should be more different, or everyone's painted that. But it doesn't matter, you know, I'll paint the same thing 10 times over. There's mugs or cups of my own that I would have drawn or painted 10, 15 times. It doesn't matter. It's the act of doing. The more you do, the more ideas you'll get. All right? So I also have a sketchbook and a notebook crammed full of bits of paper and post-it notes. If I think of something that I'd really love to draw, I'll write it down and just shove it in there. And then I'll just sit down and go through that. But I rarely have a dry patch in terms of ideas, because I sort of I give myself permission, which sounds a bit airy-fairy, but it actually makes sense, you know. At the moment, I'm completely obsessed by blue and white china, which started because I had this blue ink that I really want to use in lino printing, and I'd bought the ink, and I felt really bad because I'd bought the ink, because I don't sort of buy supplies that I don't need usually. And then I was dusting, and I have this blue and white urn, and I went, oh, that's what I'm going to do. I'm going to do a lino print of that. But I've really enjoyed the lino print, so now I've started drawing them up, and I'm painting some as well. So I sort of will let that obsession run, and then when I'm sick of it, I'll move on to something else. So that's the other thing, is if you're fascinated with reflections, then you do reflections in everything until you're sick of it. And don't worry about what anyone's going to say or what anyone else is thinking. Like, don't judge your work, okay? So subject matter, when you take all those external things off, it actually becomes a lot easier, okay? So that's subject matter. And that kind of dovetails a little bit. I mentioned one of Jen's questions last video, and this video I want to touch on, am I an art supply hoarder? Because the paint thing, I just brought up the ink, I'm actually not. At different times I have bought things that I don't use, like I bought Inktense pencils, which I never bloody use, and I've bought this other, what did I buy? Oh, liquid watercolours, which are very rare for me to use them. But outside of that, I pretty much use everything I've got. I don't buy a lot of sets. I tend to just buy individual things. The art supply store, my happy place completely. If I'm feeling a bit flat, I just go, and a tube of paint will be enough to make me happy. So if there's a new colour released, I'm always thrilled. But no, I'm not really a hoarder. I don't buy a lot that I don't use. I tend to use what I've got. With the exception of sketchbooks, I have an unholy number of sketchbooks, and I have a crazy number on the go. And most of the time I use loose leaf pieces of paper. So that's probably the big area where I do hoard. I have a lot of them. So no, I'm not really a supply hoarder. I tend to use them, and I go through a lot with my work. So that works out well. It means I can go to the art store regularly, which also dovetails into a question from Annette. So Annette asked about paper choices and what sort of paper I use. I tend to use different papers for different things, okay? For just normal drawing and sketching, I do like the paper that I mainly use for illustration work. For illustration work, I use a Daler Rowney Bristol board for airbrushing. I love this paper. It's beautifully smooth. It scans really nice. There's a slight grey tint to it, but you can correct that really easily with Photoshop and things. And it takes a lot of water. I do like that paper very much. And I use that a lot for my watercolour work or gouache work. For printmaking, I use a basic cartridge paper is what I print on. And I actually buy it in a big pile like this. So, but I buy this anyway, all right? So I buy like a ream of, this is a heavyweight cartridge, it's 150 grams, Now I use this for sketching, I use it for printmaking, I use it for writing grocery lists on, and I love buying it like this. It's actually quite cheap when you buy it as a ream in loose leaf. It's a lot more expensive to buy it in a booklet, okay, or in a sketchbook type form, or, you know, like this is the paper that I use for work mainly, and to buy it like this is really expensive. If I could buy that in loose leaf form, I would. And I tend to buy quite big and cut them down to the size I want as well. So I tend to buy at A3 and A2 size a lot, and then cut the paper to the size I want. But I've got room to store that. I've got big drawers where I can store that, so that works. But I would certainly make sure you've got a good cartridge paper, because it's great for drawing. This is from Eckersley's, so here in Australia, and this didn't cost much at all. This ends up being really cheap. I never use photocopier paper for drawing because it's too smooth. But this will even take a little bit of water, so it's a really good investment. And often when you go to an art supply store, you can just buy loose leaf sheets of paper quite cheaply, and buy a couple and find one that you like. And then when you find the paper you like, that's great. Only thing I'll say is make sure you use a heavier weight paper if it's work you're going to sell, and you need a paper then that's also pH neutral, that won't change over time. But if it's something you're going to scan and turn into prints, then it's up to you, whatever you're comfortable with. But if it's for work you're going to sell, or if I've got a commission, I always use good heavy weight quality watercolour paper. Okay, so there's another one from Annette. And then to finish up, why don't I answer... Oh, Kate. All right. What do Sinus and Phantom call me? Because obviously I call my husband Matthew Sinus Man, and if you heard him snore, you would understand why. And Phoebe became Phantom Steve. I'm not quite sure now. I can't really remember how that happened, but it happened over the years. She started out being Phantom, and then it became Phantom Steve, but she's Fants most of the time. But Phoebes and Matt, well, Phoebes calls me Mum. And Matthew tends to call me just Trace. When he's annoyed, he calls me Tracy. Over the years, he's called me all sorts of things. Noosh, Wah, you know, all the normal sort of names. But no, they don't actually give me any sort of names. You know, usually it's Mum accompanied by eye rolling from Phoebes, but I usually totally deserve that. But no, I don't really have any nicknames. Isn't that sad? I do have an alias though. My friend and I, she's Astrid and I'm Kiki. And when we go and do things together, we will decide whether or not we're going under our aliases or our real names. So, you know, that works well for us. So Astrid and Kiki can get up to trouble, and Rachel and Tracy don't get into any trouble at all. So that's about it there, Kate. It's a bit boring, isn't it? So I think that's probably enough for this video. So it looks as though we're going to have a part 3, people. I'll see you then.